Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you're joining us from. I'm Meryl Richards. I'm Director of Research on the Food and Forest team at Ceres, a nonprofit organization where we work with the most influential capital market leaders to solve the world's greatest sustainability challenges. I'm very excited to welcome you to this webinar where we're launching the Food Emissions 50 benchmark on transition planning for a 1.5C future. Food Emissions 50, for those of you who don't know, is an investor-led initiative engaging 50 of the highest emitting food companies in North America to improve their greenhouse gas emissions disclosures, set ambitious emission reduction targets, and implement climate transition plans in line with the Paris Agreement. Today, we're launching our benchmark of climate transition plans in the food sector. We'll hear more about that in just a minute, but first let me cover some logistics and introduce you to our speakers. So first, please note that this session is being recorded. We'll be providing all participants with a link to the recording shortly after it's completed. We will also have time for audience Q&A with our speakers later on in the agenda. So if you have questions throughout the webinar, please enter them in the Q&A box at the bottom right-hand corner, and we'll hopefully get to some of those during our discussion. If you have a technical question, such as trouble with audio, please also type that into the Q&A box, and we'll try to sort it out for you. And lastly, if you do need closed captioning, you can select that option in the Zoom toolbar, which is at the bottom of the Zoom screen. Next slide. As we are discussing corporate performance today, I also need to provide you with this disclaimer. First, competition and antitrust law prohibits agreements and concerted practices that have the object or effect of preventing, restricting, or distorting competition. Ceres does not require or seek collective decision-making or action with respect to acquiring, holding, disposing, and/or voting of securities. Ceres facilitates the exchange of public information, but signatories to all initiatives must not share or exchange non-public, competitively sensitive information. All decisions by investor participants are at their sole discretion and made in their individual capacities. And lastly, Ceres and its investor networks do not act or speak on behalf of each other or other investors, nor do we provide investment or proxy voting recommendations. I'll leave the slide up for just a few more seconds to allow everyone a chance to read it. Okay, thank you. Next slide. So with that being said, I want to thank each of you for participating in today's event, and I'm especially grateful to our speakers for joining us to share their views and experiences. John Hickson is the Chief Sustainability Officer and Vice President of Global Government Affairs at Yum Brands. In this role, he leads Yum's ESG and sustainability strategy, implementation, and investor-driven disclosures across the organization in partnerships with brands, franchisees, and suppliers. Additionally, he oversees US and international government relations activities. We're also joined by Nako Kobayashi. She's a manager on the Food and Forest team here at Ceres, where she leads Food Emissions 50. Nako oversees the Food Emissions 50 company benchmark, as well as issue research on climate transition planning in the food sector, including the Investor Guide to Climate Transition Plans in the US food sector, which we released last May, and upon which this benchmark is based. We have a really exciting agenda for you today on the next slide. Thanks. First, we'll hear from Nako about how we assess climate transition planning in this sector and how the highest emitting North American food companies performed. Then we'll move into our discussion with John about Yum Brands' approach to reducing their emissions. So please do enter your questions in the Q&A box, and we'll leave some time at the end for questions of both Nako and John. Before we get started, I'd also like to note that where I sit here in Northwestern Vermont, the first farmers were and are the Abenaki Nation and people, and this is their sovereign homeland. I'd like to respectfully acknowledge the ancestral and unceded territories of all Native and Indigenous peoples, both in the US and globally, who have stewarded these lands for generations with attention to both people and the environment. They are the originators of regenerative agriculture. We do this to affirm our commitment to recognize and respect the rights of Indigenous people around the world, including through our own work. So now I will turn it over to Nako.
Thanks, Meryl, for the introduction, and thanks everyone for joining our webinar today. That great context, I'll just jump right in. So if you could go to the next slide, please. A little bit of context before we get into our new findings for our new benchmark indicators. Food Emissions 50 benchmark was released in July of 2021, and it assesses 50 of the highest emitting publicly listed food companies in North America on the state of their climate action. When we launched in July of 2021, we launched with 2 indicators, emissions disclosure and emission reduction targets. As more companies have now publicly committed to reducing their emissions and have published public commitments, a lot of external stakeholders are now asking, how are companies going to get there? What plans do companies have in place in order to achieve those targets? And so to assess that, we're really excited today to launch 6 new indicators we're adding to the Food Emissions 50 benchmark that assesses key climate transition plan elements relevant to food sector companies. So I'll get to that in just a minute. And the focus of the initiative of the benchmark as a whole is really on scope 3 emissions, particularly those from land use change and agriculture, as those tend to be the largest sources of emissions in this sector. But as you'll see, our new indicators also cover other relevant emissions in this sector, such as those from food emission or food waste, from transportation distribution, and also food processing. The Food Emissions 50 benchmark informs investor engagements related to the Food Emissions 50 initiative with the 50 focus companies you'll see on the next slide. The next slide, please. So as you can see, the focus companies that are benchmarked on the Food Emissions 50 benchmark represent many different segments of the food value chain. And the key message here is that all of these companies will need to take climate actions, whether individually or also collaboratively, in order for the sector as a whole to have a chance at aligning with a 1.5 degree future, aligned with the goals of the Paris Agreement. Next slide, please. Since we launched the benchmark in July of 2021, we've seen considerable progress among the focus companies on their disclosures and targets. 30 companies out of the 50 have taken actions to improve in these areas. When we launched in July 2021, only 20 companies, less than half of the benchmark companies, had disclosed their scope 3 emissions from purchased goods and services. Now well over half are disclosing this information, and several companies have improved the disclosures by clarifying that agriculture and land use change are included in their emissions disclosures. On targets, we've seen considerable movement. When we launched, 12 companies had any kind of emissions reduction target inclusive of scope 3 emissions, and this number has more than doubled. And the number of companies with 1.5 degree aligned targets validated by the Science Based Targets Initiative has also more than doubled. So now many more companies that are benchmarked have set public commitments to reduce their emissions in line with climate science. This means that more and more external stakeholders, such as investors, are wondering, how are these companies going to achieve the ambitious targets that they are setting? And this brings us to our new indicators. Next slide, please. So from the outset of the benchmark, when we launched in July 2021, we always knew that we would benchmark companies eventually on their transition plans and following the flow of corporate expectations for climate action in the food sector. We had the expectation that companies would often start from accounting for their emissions and then setting targets to reduce them, and then developing strategies to achieve those targets that they've set. I do want to mention that this is not a linear path, and different companies may approach this progress in different ways. Some companies may want to develop all of their strategies and have that in place before publicly committing to public targets. And so the order might be different for some companies, but the key message here is that emissions disclosure and emission reduction targets are really foundational elements of having a robust plan to align with a 1.5 degree future. Next slide, please. So with that, here are the 8 indicators that are now assessed in the Food Emissions 50 benchmark. Given time constraints, I will not have time to go through every indicator or the metrics assessed under them, but I do encourage everyone to visit our Food Emissions 50 website, where we've released the methodology as well as a public data file that you can download to explore all the corporate assessments. And we also have individual company scorecard pages so you can explore how different companies performed on each of these indicators. So the 8 indicators include 2 of the indicators we've already been benchmarking before. The first set of 3 indicators really points to the scope, ambition, and accountability of the plans that companies are developing. So does the plan cover all three scopes of emissions? Are they aimed at achieving ambitious targets and that cover all scopes of emissions? And are companies staying accountable to implementing their plans and achieving their targets by disclosing their progress? The next four set of indicators point towards the key food sector specific emission reduction strategy that should be disclosed in climate transition plans. And these come directly, as Meryl mentioned, from the report that we released in last May called the Investor Guide to Climate Transition Plans in the US Food Sector. That report was highly vetted and incorporated input from companies, investors, several NGOs, and consulting firms and academics to ensure that the recommendations were science aligned, decision useful for investors, and actionable by companies. And within that report, we identified 4 key areas within a food company's business that could be better aligned with the emission reduction targets to ensure that the business strategies and the climate strategies were well aligned. And those 4 areas were growth and innovation strategy, corporate procurement strategy, operations, waste and transportation, and customer engagement. And finally, the last indicator we added to our benchmark was the quantification of strategy. So this indicator is really assessing whether companies have quantified their strategies that they're implementing, is assessing the 4 indicators that I just mentioned, and seeing, if companies are successful in doing everything that they've set out to do. Are they on track to achieving their target? Are there major gaps that they still need to figure out strategies to help address? So really quantifying everything helps kind of ensure that the transition plan is robust, ambitious enough, and comprehensive enough to get the company to where they need to be to achieve their targets by 2030 or whatever other target date they might have set out to achieve. And just a quick teaser, none of the companies that we assessed showed evidence of doing so. So this is a clear area of progress for a lot of the companies. Next slide, please. So before I get into some of our key findings, I do want to mention that we did not assess all 50 of the focus companies on these new indicators. As I mentioned, we really view emissions disclosure and emission reduction targets as foundational elements to having a robust transition plan. If a company has only disclosed scope 1 and 2 emissions, for example, then any plan that they might put together is unlikely to substantially cover scope 3 emissions reduction strategies. Similarly, if a company has only set scope 1 and 2 targets, then any plan that they disclose will be only useful in understanding what companies will do to achieve those scope 1 and 2 targets, which for food companies represents a very small portion of their overall emissions footprint. So with that said, we only assess the companies on our focus list that have disclosed scope 3 emissions from purchased goods and services, and those that have set emissions reduction targets that include scope 3 emissions. So as you can see in gray are the companies that we did not assess because they lacked one or both of these elements. And I think you can see that the food retail and hypermarkets and supercenters industries are appearing as a laggard on our benchmark, given that we were only able to benchmark 2 of the companies, given the state of kind of poor disclosure and target setting in those industries currently. There are some of those companies that have committed to publishing commitments to reduce their emissions shortly. So as soon as any of the companies in gray disclose new information about their emissions or set new targets, then in the next iteration of our benchmark update, we will assess those companies on the new indicators. The next slide, please. So given time, I likely won't have time to go through every single indicator that we assessed and every metric in detail, but I did want to provide some highlights. Again, please feel free to explore the data on our website for more information. One of the key indicators that we were assessing was growth and innovation strategy. And we did find within this indicator that few companies in the sector were strategically linking the future growth of their business with their emission reduction goals. So to point out a few examples, within the third bar down that you see on this slide, CapEx and OpEx, we found that no companies that we benchmarked, so the 27 that we did assess, none of them were aligning or publicly committing to aligning their future expenditures, including capital expenditures and operational expenditures with their climate goals. And what this means is that companies, have not publicly committed or shown any methodology to align, their future growth of their business and the investments that they'll make towards them with their emission reduction targets. And that could lead to them having unaligned business goals and climate goals, and not being able to meet the emissions goals that they've set can introduce new material financial risks in the future. And so it is in a lot of companies' best interest to make sure that these objectives are aligned. And we did find that some companies have started to explore internal carbon prices and other methods to assess the carbon liability of new investments that they're making, but none have yet clearly committed to aligning all future expenditures with their emission reduction targets. Another area we're seeing more progress is within R&D and innovation. A lot of companies are experimenting with new product profile mixes and new ingredients that they can use. Some are exploring plant-based alternatives, and we're seeing a lot of climate-related R&D, but there were only 3 companies of the 27 we assessed that were clearly having a business-wide strategy to align all the different R&D and innovation that they're doing within their business with their emission reduction targets. So that is also an area for further growth. Next slide, please. So as I've mentioned, Scope 3 emissions, particularly those from land use change in agriculture, are a really large portion of the emissions in this sector. And so I don't think it comes as a surprise that a lot of companies are making progress in the area and really trying to tackle their supply chain emissions. However, in our benchmark, we note that there is a lot of room for companies to more target and prioritize some of their climate action in their supply chain. So in the very first row of this graphic, you'll notice that a combined 15 companies, just over half, clearly identify the key drivers of their Scope 3 emissions from purchased goods and services. And what that means is that not all of the companies we assessed are clearly identifying how much of their supply chain emissions, so the Scope 3 emissions from purchased goods and services, are coming from different sources. So X% coming from agriculture, whereas X% are coming from land use change, X% might be coming from packaging related emissions, and not knowing what that breakdown looks like for companies makes it very difficult for external stakeholders to assess whether the companies are prioritizing the major drivers of their emissions. For example, one company could have disclosed a lot of information about how they're engaging their wheat suppliers and their wheat supply chain on reducing emissions from wheat production, which is really great. However, if that company has a lot of exposure to dairy, but has not disclosed that most of their emissions come from dairy, external stakeholders might not immediately understand that the lack of disclosure on what the company is doing to tackle their dairy emissions means that there's a big lack in their disclosures in terms of hitting a major source of their emissions. And so we really looked at whether companies were disclosing key drivers, and then based on that, what actions they were disclosing to address those key drivers, which you see on the second row of this graphic. Next slide, please. I think it's not surprising that we do see, I think, the most progress being made across our new indicators within the area of operations, waste, and transportation, because this is often where food companies have the most direct control, especially pertaining to their energy use and efficiency. But it's clear that more action is needed to scale these initiatives at a rate consistent with emissions reductions needed in this sector. So for example, you'll note in the second bar in the graphic, there are 17 companies that are demonstrating that they're investing in improving energy efficiency throughout their business, but there were no companies that were committing to fully decarbonizing their operations, including by switching to alternative heat sources for combustion as alternatives to natural gas. So although companies are investing in energy efficiency, there's still some gaps there in terms of, thinking through the more innovative ways to fully decarbonize operations related to food processing related emissions. We also see a lot of companies in the bar second from the bottom. We see a lot of companies are adopting lower and zero emissions transportation within their fleets. However, there was only one company that demonstrated kind of more comprehensive a business-wide strategy that includes both private and third-party fleets. So a lot of food companies rely on third-party fleets and contracted fleets to do their transportation and distribution. And a lot of times the pilot projects on lower zero emissions transportation tends to happen first within privately owned fleets and then expand to engagement with contracted fleets. And so we do see that as another area where companies have leverage to accelerate the transition to lower emissions fleets across the economy. And on the next slide, a final area that we were looking at where companies do have leverage to accelerate the transition to a lower emissions economy is in the way that they engage their customers. And then it's important to note that for the companies on our list, some of their customers are consumers, especially for retailers and for restaurants. But some of the companies, such as agricultural products companies, their customers are the other companies that are being benchmarked by us. So what customer engagement looks like sort of depends a bit on what the company is, but there is a lot of opportunity for companies to engage their customers in a shift to lower emissions products and services, as well as on mitigating the end of life emissions associated with the products that they're selling. And we found that just 7 companies are engaging customers in this area, including Yum Brands is one of the companies, so I'm sure we'll talk a bit about that later. And then only 12 companies are engaging customers on mitigating the end of life emissions. And this could look like renovating the way that you're packaging your products so that they're more easily recyclable, integrating more composting bins and things in restaurant sites, and other innovative ways to ensure that the products that are being sold are being able to be disposed of in ways with lower emission footprints. Next slide, please. And finally, the last indicator that we added to our benchmark, I did a little teaser earlier that none of the assessed companies are quantifying their plans. And this obviously is a very challenging space because there are a lot of emerging accounting frameworks for particularly land-based emissions. But we find that even roughly estimating and projecting out the emissions reductions that you might be able to attain by successfully implementing strategies can help companies better understand what any gaps are to their target. So if they lay out everything that they are doing and find, oh, we actually have a substantial gap between what we're projecting to be able to achieve and what we have committed to publicly within our target, then it gives them a little bit of an idea of where to, adjust their strategies or where they may want to innovate. Do they need to adjust their product portfolio mix to better close that gap? And finding out later, closer to 2030, when these targets are due, is going to leave companies with not very much time to adjust strategies. And it could expose companies to a lot of risks related to, all of the things that are coming down, whether it be regulatory risks, consumer related, reputational risks and other key risks. And it risks undermining the company's resilience in the face of climate change. And so we feel that this is an important one where we're hoping to see more progress as more data becomes available and a lot of companies are starting to make some progress towards getting to be able to quantify their strategies. Next slide, please. So to conclude with some key takeaways, we found generally across all of our indicators that current disclosures tend to focus on past and current sustainability performance rather than forward-looking action plans. This is in part due to the way that some of the existing frameworks are worded, which makes sense that companies reporting on what they did in the current reporting year and previous years. But we do emphasize that when we were benchmarking companies, we were only looking at publicly available data. So we're not proposing a new disclosure framework by any means. And we do see a lot of room in existing frameworks like CDP for companies to speak to what they will do in the next few years to achieve their targets. Added specificity and clarity can really be helpful for external stakeholders to better understand what the company's specific role is in accelerating the emissions reductions that they're promising. Many companies understandably start with smaller scale initiatives and pilots, but we saw a lack in discussion on how companies will really scale these to cover a wider portion of their business, and how they will scale them to, meet the emissions reductions needed to align with their targets. Again, no companies have really quantified their emission reduction plans, or disclosed the potential gaps for their goals. And we've heard from investors that even if there is a substantial gap, they prefer to see it and understand that there's a gap and appreciate that transparency rather than being blindsided in 2030 because there's such a big gap that they weren't aware of. And finally, few companies are discussing how the future growth for their business can be aligned with their emission reduction goals. And I think this is a key area that companies are thinking about and tackling. So I'm sure we'll see more progress in this space as we move forward towards 2030. So with that, I will turn it back to Meryl and happy to answer any questions in the Q&A session or in the chat.
Thank you so much, Nako. It's great to see the progress. And it's also clear that there's still a lot of work to do to make sure we can get to where we need to be in 2030. Just a reminder to our audience to put in questions for Nako and for John as we discuss in the Q&A box. We've got a couple questions coming in already, so thank you for that. Now we'll bring on John to hear how Yum Brands is approaching some of these key strategies for reducing emissions. So welcome, John. Before we get into the details, I thought you could provide a quick overview of Yum's approach to ESG and how it fits into its broader business strategy.
Thanks, Meryl. Nako, happy to do that and happy to be here. And it's a pleasure and I really appreciate the chance for the conversation. It's a great and challenging topic. So looking forward to the conversation. A little bit about Yum, just for people that may not know about Yum Brands. I think more commonly known as KFC, Taco Bell, Pizza Hut are restaurant brands that we have. We have 55,000 restaurants globally and a little over 155 countries. So very much a global participant in the world's food system in the retail kind of consumer facing restaurant space. And a little bit about kind of ESG and climate and our overall journey, I would say, is that if you look at it, I think we're pretty typical the way probably a lot of companies have evolved and are trying to evolve and lean in on this, is where we always had like a core corporate strategy and a sustainability strategy. And it was our recipe for growth and our recipe for good. And what we really have done over the years, probably started most notably with a lot of clarity in our recipe for growth around food, planet, and people, getting clear on some of those strategies. And then it's been a series of years we've worked on integration and alignment. So back when our most recent CEO took the CEO job almost 2.5, 3 years ago, we elevated our recipe for good, which was our sustainability strategy, and a recipe for growth. And then most recently, we've really kind of tried to really fully integrate that into a recipe for good growth. And I think that started with some realignment we did at the board in how we report ESG material into the board so that they see the strategy and the tactics and the outcomes of the data, how we're doing. And that's working its way through the company on governance. So kind of the journey started with getting a little clarity around sustainability, and then over the years trying to evolve it to be much more embedded to where now it's much more an integrated strategic approach overall.
Great, thanks so much, John. So Yum Brands has set ambitious targets to reduce GHG emissions across scopes 1, 2, and 3 by 2030 to make progress towards your ambition to be net zero emissions by 2050. Can you talk a little bit more about how Yum's sustainability journey and how you approach translating these longer term ambitions to concrete actions you can take now throughout your operations, supply chain, and in partnership with your franchisees?
Sure. Part of this is we've fortunately had a long history, at least, of trying to get our hands around our emissions. Our early energy reduction targets, which related to our emissions, were done in 2006. And then we started on CDP disclosure, the Carbon Disclosure Project back then, I think it was called, but the CDP disclosures around climate that helped track and build that. So did a lot of years of kind of getting comfortable with our knowledge around that. And it was really leading into the science-based target work that we did in 2019 that really helped set a broader scope around that. And from that time, we've tried to do our disclosures into the CDP with an assurance on them and covering scope 1, 2, and 3. So it's a little bit of our process has been have the elevated goal, have transparency on your disclosures, and then after that, we've had to figure out, okay, what's that action plan look like? What is our approach? So I think one thing that is very clear in the agricultural and food system space is kind of goal setting is well beyond measurement, reporting, and verification. As a practical matter, if you look at the science-based targets and the GHG protocols, a lot of what those emissions are based on factors. What's your volume? What's your origination footprint? And what's the factor that is kind of preloaded that really oftentimes relates a little bit to production process, but a lot of it is around origin of just where the product's from. So when we realized that, we really had to kind of unpack and say, okay, what's a strategy look like then, how we can try to move forward? And we've tried to do that then around 3 different elements, knowing that macro measurement piece may almost be a laggard to catch up, if you will. So how do we drive change and engage and kind of lean in on the right way? So our approach has been really anchored around kind of a 3-pronged strategy. First is try to lean in with our partners in the supply chain on like specific projects that our brands or Yum can do to drive the innovation, research, the understanding of what those pathways are for emissions reductions that are going on out there. We've got one underway with Pizza Hut and dairy. We've got another one that's very close to being, we got all the contracts signed and rolling out. Then another one in the queue that will also be with our protein. So kind of do pilots against the research that was done on our science-based targets initiative that really said we need to look at chicken, beef, and dairy as our 3 main sources of scope 3 emissions, as well as our franchisee restaurant emissions. So as we unpack those and on the more traditional side of scope 3, so the strategy evolves around unique engagements where we can drive, be transparent, and learn with our suppliers. Then we also really try to lean in with supply chain collaboration, larger multi-sector initiatives, the Roundtable for Sustainable Beef, palm, poultry, and eggs, those sorts of collaborations that bring producers through retailers, processors all together to really help align on these big challenges. And we've used some of those platforms too for broader educational efforts. So we've done some things on supplier education and those sorts of elements. And then last but not least is also engage in those conversations around data. We know it's a laggard. We know it's going to be several years behind given kind of the commingled nature of products, the smallholder to the small size of operations and nature of global supply chains. But nonetheless, how can we collectively work on data? How can we engage with the broader supply chain efforts? And then how can we do unique projects that help advance the science, the understanding of not only our own supply chains and systems, but also just the work that needs to be done, broadly speaking, overall.
Great. We'll dig in a little more to some of those strategies that you mentioned. So thanks for foreshadowing that. In the meantime, I wanted to ask about leadership and support for climate goals within an organization. We all know how important that is to figure out how to operationalize the work, how to find resources. What advice do you have for companies that are just getting started or those that still have to gain buy-in around climate targets and especially around scope 3?
It's a challenge and you have to take the first steps. I think really trying to understand your baseline, using the best technology and information that's out there is kind of step one. Making sure people in your organization understand the why and kind of there are savings opportunities certainly associated with decarbonization as well. So for us, it was a long, I would love to tell you it was a quick process. It was not, I don't know how many meetings we had with the team globally to kind of take the support that we had from leadership and the board, go through the baseline and the target setting process of SBTI. But then before we went public with it was probably another 6 months of internal meetings around the world with regional markets to kind of help them understand the why, what the basic steps of the journey were likely to be, even though we didn't have it all fully baked on day one. And I don't think many companies will. part of this space is getting a little comfortable with courage to set an aspiration out there, be comfortable with being transparent on what you can report and what you can't report, but continue to show progress and engage with stakeholders so that there aren't surprises. If we see something that's a challenge, we try to let people know kind of what we're seeing out there. But it takes time and that kind of a process to first have the leadership buy-in, but then bringing it through an organization is, for most large companies, a big challenge.
Thank you so much. So we have a question in our chat that is actually anticipating what I was next going to ask you. So one of the key indicators that we assess in our benchmark relates to corporate procurement strategies and supply chain implementation. And in your disclosures, Yum Brands notes that 76% of your emissions come from poultry, beef, and dairy, as you mentioned. So could you speak a bit to how this level of analysis, going beyond looking at Scope 3 category, purchase goods and services, and really getting deep, is helping you better understand how to tackle your Scope 3 emissions? And then we also have a question on this in the chat, which is what type of products or tools do you need to better measure Scope 3 to enable better reporting?
Yeah, for starters, I would say on our overall supply chains, we've done a number of kind of precursor work, I guess I would say. We did a supply chain. We have a lot of great partners out there. But WWF is one of them, and they helped us a lot. We did a supply chain risk assessment well before our science-based targets work that really helped us on this journey of risk prioritization in terms of, when you think holistically, climate matters a great deal. For sure, that's our topic today. But there are other things, human rights, there's a lot of challenges that are out there. So we did, first several years ago, kind of a holistic supply chain risk assessment that helped take a look at what data we had and where were key products coming from, where were they going to, and where could we then begin to prioritize a little bit based on risk and volume and those sorts of things. So that was kind of step one on our journey. Then if you keep rolling forward, we continue to do that in that science-based target work. And that does lead in, I think Nako mentioned that we've also done a lot of work on baselining. So we have our own baseline work that was done with science-based targets. We've done a handful, not too many, but a handful of select kind of reviews of baselines in certain markets and geographies. And then we look at all kinds of external data, whether it's the UN's global livestock emissions factors and their baselines. Again, a number of NGOs have them as well, and try to boil that down so that we feel like we are really leaning in on the right hotspots. And one of them that was stated from Nako was the land use and land conversion kind of concepts. So even before we set our science-based targets, Yum had targets on palm oil and fiber, for example, but we really sought to pull those across other key categories like beef and soy, knowing they're an extreme challenge. It is a practical reality. It's not easy to get the visibility on those. And having worked in a supply chain company for a long time, even those much closer to the ground struggle on how to really quantify that. But nonetheless, kind of join that level of aspiration. So we endorsed the UN's New York Declaration on Forest to effectively harmonize, pull across our deforestation policies across all key supply chains, which helps us really lean in, again, with a lot of other partnerships along the way on how to try and do the best we can on prevention, mitigation, and verification within those supply chains. So it's, again, whether it's the roundtable on sustainable palm or some of the ones where we may not buy that much from a particular region, how can we still be an active voice because it's a global hotspot, like some of the work around Brazil and beef and that kind of thing. So it's kind of a mix of things, but for us, it started with overall supply chain risk assessment, then looking at what we knew from baselines, zeroing in on hotspots, and then trying to find the most effective partners we could to try and address either the data gaps or visibility gaps and or baselines that we may have.
That's great. So my next question is actually about some of those partnerships. So, as you mentioned, Yum relies on a lot of indirect suppliers, and much of the emissions that you need to address come from the farm level, as you mentioned. So can you speak to how you're leveraging partnerships? And you mentioned the Pizza Hut's partnership with Dairy Farmers of America to engage stakeholders upstream in your supply chain. And are you considering other approaches for other brands or commodities that are key drivers of emissions?
We are, and it gets back to those hotspots. I think what we've seen is that there's a great piece out. I'm going to give too many shout outs to individual organizations. There's another great piece of work. Again, there's a great piece of work from Stanford that goes over data and measurement that just came out a couple of weeks ago that really highlights the challenges in the measurement, reporting, and verification space, even in markets like the US, where we arguably have the most well-defined and easily visible and transparent food system in the world with one of the lowest emissions footprints. Data and verification are still a challenge there. So great paper there. We've also looked, WWF put out a number of papers on food systems emission by supply chain in Q4 that were composite looks at all these things. It really tends to say we need to look at land use conversion and deforestation, which I think we kind of knew, but it's nice to get additional layers of data that show that's the right spot to look. And then around feed efficiencies is a big key component of it. We do see great opportunities, particularly in beef, for massive reductions, I think, that will come there in feed efficiencies relative to beef. And then waste systems and waste mitigation. So it's kind of my farm background says you look at the front end of the animal and the back end of the animal, and then a little bit the broader context where the growing cycle occurs. Those are the three main areas that we use, and they are somewhat different for each of them. And again, I think I like our strategies, but sometimes you do strategies to mitigate risk, and sometimes you'd like to do strategies that also drive change. So we really try to minimize our procurement from anything exposed to Brazil relative to beef. It's great for us, but we also need to engage in that conversation. So we're trying to find ways to engage in that conversation constructively, even though we really don't source from there. We know overall in the broader scheme of global efforts around beef, we do need to be engaged there as well. So some of it is based on that. The other parts of it really get into the feed system. When you look at global poultry, soy is a critical component to it. Again, for us, most of our poultry is locally sourced wherever we operate. It's kind of one of our key strategies, which is a huge de-risking strategy because we're not heavily reliant upon one particular source for all of our chicken. It's really local in almost all of our markets for KFC, but that leaves you in a much more complex situation relative to identifying your soy. So we've tried to look at what are critical links, critical hotspots, critical places where maybe the consumption market and the origination market on those feed ingredients have the right level of where's the greatest interest and momentum behind it, and how can we lean in to then learn and use that in other markets where candidly there may not be that much consumer insight or interest in the underlying market and some of those challenges, but can we learn from those conversations and research projects and things we've done with our suppliers where they are engaged in higher risk, higher sensitivity markets, if you will. And soy is probably a good example of that.
So I want to turn to talk a little bit about growth and innovation strategies. So you mentioned, some of these forward-looking issues and research projects, and a key area that we found that most companies are still very much in the early stages is aligning forward-looking growth and innovation strategy, R&D, product development, CapEx and OpEx with their emission reduction targets. So could you talk a little bit about how Yum! Brands approaches elevating your climate commitments as a material consideration for your company's forward-looking growth strategy?
Yeah, a lot of what we've done is we used our TCFD risk analysis. So we did a TCFD analysis a couple of years now. But we tend to look at the new data that we come in for surveys each year from our sustainability systems, and they're still aligned back with that original research that was done. And it kind of indicated kind of where we need to kind of lean in the most. What it showed was we expect the highest likelihood of risks and kind of, the TCFD looks at transitory risk, acute risk, and kind of regulatory risk are the three different categories that they tend to use. And I think we see greatest regulatory risk coming from Europe. It's not really a surprise, but it indicates that there are lots of challenges there. So we've really tried to center some of our research, those additional baselines, that innovation, those places of trying to look in those markets where our TCFD analysis aligns and says, yes, this is where you're going to have kind of the greatest commercial risk. So that's been one way we've tried to focus those resources. I think the other is really trying to look at technology and whether that's, there's been great innovations in geospatial monitoring around particularly the land conversion story. It's a hugely valuable component for us in Southeast Asia. relative to palm oil. We're trying to look and see and really push the conversation to see if there are opportunities where that sort of land conversion monitoring, not just I always say you don't want a shiny penny in a bad bank. Like, how do you make sure that the jurisdiction, the region, the total area that you're drawing from is doing the right behaviors? For that, you really need more transparency on that broader system or landscape wide size space. So we're trying to look at the learnings that have occurred in some areas like Southeast Asia, and we'll say, can we join with others to drive innovation, drive collaboration in some other supply chains? So those kind of talks continue. And then the last pace on innovation is our own systems and understanding. I think we take for granted a lot of our technology has been deployed on the consumer side and on our back of house or restorations operation management for energy efficiency. We know we need to get better. Most big companies probably struggle with this if the left hand, the right hand knew what they were doing, kind of thing. So it's a challenge, but we're trying to be on that journey of really making sure that our technology spend that drives down energy and is energy savings gets reflected in our sustainability reports. Because sometimes that GHG reduction in the way the project was sold in may have only been a financial consideration up front. So really bringing this more holistically to some of our innovation investments around building management systems and those sorts of things.
And how have you evaluated the costs and benefits and the ROI of different emission reduction strategies? And have you leveraged those analyses to drive your decisions and actions?
Yeah, we have. We continue to do them. So it started with when you do a science-based targets. I guess I only have a data point of one of how ours was, but it had a lot of that core work in it. So when you understand what your baseline is, kind of where your key areas for emissions reductions are, you normally then develop a marginal cost curve of where those steps can be taken to drive down that change. And that's been a key part. We've done other baselines and done other pieces of research to reaffirm. And we always are trying to learn. Technology is moving very, very fast, particularly in the renewable side of this conversation, but trying to learn, are things changing against the marginal cost curve that we initially saw in our first research, and then trying to line up areas of intervention in those areas that had the greatest ROI first. We know that if this is viewed only as a cost, its uptake will always be slow. It's just a constant challenge in any sustainability effort. It doesn't matter whether it's climate or any other particular action, but are there ways you can understand where cost savings are? And some of those energy efficiency ones are great examples of where, especially as the global situation around energy and power and some of those things got really upended in the last 18 months, all of a sudden those ROIs look even better if you're doing things to drive down your energy emissions. So try to relook at the baselines, keep them updated and understand where they're moving, and then take advantage of any of those efficiency ones. And as a practice standpoint, have to start on the best ROI and work our way across. And then also, as you look ahead, look around corners of how can we collaborate on these ones that are super expensive and try to drive innovations and maybe collaborative efforts that lower those costs.
Well, John, this has been really interesting, and I could ask many more questions, but I want to give our audience a chance to chime in as well. So we've had several questions coming in. We have one actually from our LinkedIn live stream. I'm asking about some of the pilot projects that you mentioned. It's from Philip Rothrock who's wondering, I'm curious if you came across any surprises in your pilot results.
Interesting. I think one of our, yes, there's always surprises. I say nothing else. All this should be delivered with a great deal of humility. I've been in the food system space for most of my career at a global level, and I think you're always running. There's always something unique or odd, or maybe you hadn't thought of that comes up in your learnings. I think on our soy journey, for example, we started with a project looking most closely at our draw areas right around. Again, we don't buy a lot of poultry from Brazil that gets exported, but there is some. And so we started there with what our food safety and quality teams were doing that had visibility down to deforestation measures kind of on the ground. Then we tried to overlay that with where maybe soy might be coming from as well in those areas as we look at markets like Europe. And I think some of the surprises we learned is indeed some of those areas that are positioned well for export in poultry may also be positioned well for soy. So there was more of a natural nexus there that gives us a little more confidence. So there are things like that, little aha moments, I say, that come out. And then there are also where it's like, ooh, that's even more hard than we thought, so they're not always roses. You learn kind of interesting opportunities and interesting challenges where you may need to find other partners, other new ways to solve it. But that's just one example of where we didn't know we had a layer of overlap that actually occurred in a little more positive way than we thought by doing kind of two different pieces of research internally and externally with a partner that we're looking at different products, different things, but they really all of a sudden found, hey, if we're going to do an engagement on the ground, maybe this is the spot for it, that kind of thing.
That's great. We have another question this is an anonymous question. How are you working to improve data without imposing burdensome requirements on your suppliers? And thinking specifically of farmers. And I know this is something that a lot of folks are thinking about.
I feel like that one's coming from one of our suppliers because our survey, it's tough. It is hard. I think a lot of it is listening and engaging. Because I get a lot of very blunt, very direct feedback from our suppliers on the difficulty. And I've been in food systems my whole career. I understand the challenges and disaggregated nature of supply chain distribution. So I think one of us, we're trying to continue to listen and work with them and engage with them as well. So it's a challenge. We know you can't. My dad was a farmer. I keep thinking of all these questions. If I was asking him, he would severely roll his head. And that was in a farm that was, using crop rotation and grazing rotation and all kinds of things that were done largely for economic reasons, but they absolutely conveyed the right environmental benefits as well. And he would show up as a heathen on any survey that we do, probably. So I think there is a disconnect, and we need to continue to listen to our suppliers, listen to their suppliers, and find ways to better, yes, get data, but also tell that story of where those positive elements exist, because it is hard. And if you don't jump straight into trying to see how you can craft unique supply chain data for GHG protocol emissions factors, it's going to be complex and overwhelm your system. So I think we're trying to listen to them, trying to work with them. Those roundtables really play a key element of that conversation where they can directly say, okay, I don't like what you're doing, but maybe there's an alternative to something we can do that begins to get a little more measurable value of what the system's actually doing relative to performance.
Thank you so much. So our next question is from Roxy Sharif, and it's slightly off topic, but I know that you've been working on deforestation and supply chains for quite some time. So is your company looking into nature-related risk, impact, and dependence in accordance with the TNFD? And are you getting requests from investors in this regard? And how are you prioritizing investments regarding data and processes or policy updates for working with suppliers to capture the right data for not only climate, but nature risk as well?
Lots of conversations around TNFD and FLAG. I think if you think of science-based targets in a food systems context, most folks would probably acknowledge that they weren't perfectly designed. A helpful start, a likely element we needed to go through, but I think some of the reason that TNFD and FLAG guidance are both coming up reflect kind of the measurement, reporting, and verification challenges, and kind of the value of land use change prevention in the system. It's not really that easily reflected in science-based targets. So we are looking at all of those. I think as a practical matter, and this is just more battle scars in the industry and in food systems change, the more you have simple solutions, simple definitions, the greater likelihood you can really drive change and success. And the more they get complex, I think we know that they're less likely to be impactful and offer a real value of change. And I think that's one of the things we're really struggling with, is they look pretty complex right now. So if you think of the challenges we all have on a global level around deforestation, where you really, in some parts of the world, have very clear definitions on what that word means or not, and it's X number of above ground carbon and that kind of thing, you can really drive change there. I think if you look at that nature conversation, we know it's critical, but I don't think we really know how to define it yet. And from what I've seen on TNFD, I'm not sure it's really actionable yet either. So it's on our to-do list, and it's something we are definitely looking at, but we do have concerns around just, is it so complex that it's non-executable? So I think we're looking at both those two tools. expect them to be on the to-do list in the next year or two. But they are on the frontiers. If the prior world was setting goals beyond the capacity for MRV, I think we may be having kind of frameworks beyond the capacity of execution. So we're trying to really learn more and be in that like learning phase, I guess I would say, when we think about global complexities and supply chains.
Thanks. I think there's a lot of work to be done to figure out how we measure nature and how we quantify those things. So thanks so much. And so thank you to Nako as well for joining us. I think we'll wrap up Q&A now because I do have a couple additional events to alert people to. So John and Nako, thank you so much for joining us today. Really appreciate it. If we could go bring the slides back up. We do ask all of you to let us know how we're doing. So please take a moment to scan this quick survey so we can continue to host, really fantastic speakers and engaging webinars like this one. You can scan the QR code and it will also be dropped in the chat. And then I also want to note a few upcoming initiatives and events. So next slide. First of all, we urge any companies or investors on the line to sign the Freedom to Invest statement and join 250 leading investors and companies to call on policymakers to protect the freedom to invest responsibly. Go to freedomtoinvest.org to learn more. Next slide. Lead on a Clean Economy Lawmaker Education and Advocacy Days that will take place in person in Washington, D.C. and virtually are coming up. Join us in climate advocacy at ceres.org/lead. Next slide. Ceres is also launching a sustainability course in partnership with Michigan Ross School of Business for current and prospective board members. It starts in September, and you can find all the relevant information at ceres.org course. And last but not least, next slide, we have our annual Evening with Ceres that will be held in San Francisco on October 16th. So a little bit of time to plan for this one. It's a great event, and it's always a lot of fun. So ceres.org Evening with Ceres. And last slide, if you're interested in any of these events, please head to our website to learn more. And as always, follow us on social media. And do feel free to reach out with any questions or comments. Nako's email is on that slide. So if you've got complaints, you can send them her way, and any questions as well. So thank you all so much for joining us today, and have a great rest of your day.